A 26-year-old waitress with tired eyes and a gentle smile, froze in place with a coffee pot in her trembling hand. It had been a long morning, the kind that weighed heavily on her shoulders, but she kept going because she always had to. The diner was her lifeline, her only source of income after her mother's medical bills swallowed every bit of savings she once had. She wiped the sweat from her forehead and forced herself to breathe, ready to serve the next table. But she had no idea that within minutes, her entire world was going to collapse, and then be rebuilt by two unexpected heroes. The two police officers at table 7 had walked in with loud voices and louder attitudes, the kind of presence that filled a room in all the worst ways. Emily had approached them like she approached everyone, respectfully, even if her heart already tightened at the hostility on their faces. They looked like men used to getting their way, and her instincts warned her to tread carefully. She placed the menus down gently and asked if they wanted anything to drink. One of the officers smirked at her name tag and asked something she pretended she didn't hear. But she simply smiled and repeated her question, hoping, praying, the interaction would stay normal. It didn't. The first officer ordered coffee, the second iced tea. Emily nodded, stepped away, and returned with their drinks. As she leaned in to place the iced tea on the table, the first officer deliberately nudged her arm. The cup tipped, spilling over her apron and down the side of her leg. The shock of the cold liquid made her jump back, but before she could apologize or react, the officer said loudly, "Watch where you're going." His partner slapped the table laughing, as if it were the funniest thing he'd seen all week. Emily's cheeks burned with humiliation. She murmured, "I'm so sorry," even though she had done nothing wrong, and moved to clean up the mess. But that, as it turned out, was only the beginning. A few booths over, a quiet man in a dark hoodie had been watching. He sat alone with a service dog beside him, a strong, alert German shepherd with intelligent eyes. The man's face was calm but focused, the way someone looks when they've trained their whole life to stay aware of everything around them. His name was Ryan Brooks, a Navy SEAL recently back from deployment and trying to adjust to civilian life. After losing two close teammates in his last mission, he was struggling to find peace. He came to the diner often because it felt familiar. It reminded him of the places he used to visit with the team. But today, as he watched the officers harassing the young waitress, a different kind of alertness sharpened in his chest. Emily returned to the counter, took a deep breath, and forced herself to keep working. She wiped her hands, grabbed the pot of hot coffee, and headed back to table 7. Her fingers shook slightly, but she tried her best to stay composed. The second officer looked her up and down with a disrespect that made her stomach twist. "Took you long enough," he muttered. Emily managed a polite smile and began to pour coffee into his partner's cup. That was when it happened. The officer intentionally jerked his hand upward, hitting the pot. The hot coffee splashed across Emily's forearm, and she gasped as the burning liquid scorched her skin. The pot nearly slipped from her hands, and tears pricked her eyes. But the officers only laughed, loud and cruel, like spectators at a show meant solely for their entertainment. Something inside Emily shattered. She held her arm tightly, fighting the pain, humiliation, and fear that rushed through her like a breaking. Damn. She stepped back, whispering, "I'm so sorry," even though she couldn't understand why she was the one apologizing. The officer leaned in close and muttered something under his breath, something that made her heart sink further. Ryan rose slowly from his booth. His dog, Shadow, stood up with him, ears pointed and body stiff with alertness. Ryan had seen many things in his lifetime, wars, chaos, cruelty, but something about watching an innocent woman being treated like that ignited a rage he had buried deep. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, it was quiet, controlled, and sharp, the kind of resolve that came from years of training and a heart that still refused to tolerate injustice. He walked toward the table, his steps steady, his expression unreadable. Emily, breathing hard from pain, didn't see him at first. But the officers did. They sat up straighter, confused but unfazed, because they didn't yet understand who they were dealing with. Ryan stopped at the edge of their table. "That's enough." The room seemed to shrink. The chatter died down, silverware clinks softened. Everyone turned toward the sound of his voice. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, a voice that had once given life or death commands and been obeyed without question. The first officer scoffed, Who the hell are you? Ryan held his gaze. Someone who's not going to let you treat her like that. Shadow growled, low and powerful, stepping slightly forward. The officers stiffened. Even from a distance, a trained K9 was unmistakable. But they still tried to hold their ground. Emily finally looked up and saw Ryan standing there. She froze. For a moment, she didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified at what might come next. The officer leaned back in his seat, trying to act confident. Mind your business. Ryan didn't move. She is my business. Anyone being hurt in front of me is my business. The second officer stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. You wanna make this a problem? Ryan took one step closer. Shadow mirrored him with perfect synchronicity, eyes locked on the threat. The diner was silent now, every person inside sensing a moment they would never forget. Let me make something clear, Ryan said, his tone controlled yet unwavering. You poured hot coffee on her. You shoved her. You've harassed her this entire time. And you think wearing that badge makes it okay? The officers exchanged a look, unsure of whether to escalate or back down. Ryan continued, I've spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL. I've seen men with real power, real courage, real honor. None of them look like either of you. The officer took a step forward, but Shadow barked sharply, teeth bared, forcing him back. Customers gasped, someone dropped a spoon, and the diner manager peeked out from the kitchen, too scared to intervene. Emily felt tears slide down her cheeks, not from pain this time, but from the overwhelming realization that someone, finally, was standing up for her. Ryan turned slightly toward her. Are you okay? She nodded weakly, wiping tears from her face. I'm fine, she whispered, though her shaking hands told a different story. No, you're not, Ryan said gently. But you will be. The first officer finally snapped. This is harassment of law enforcement. Ryan cracked a humorless smile. No, this is holding you accountable. He pulled out his phone and began recording. Several customers followed suit. The officers didn't expect that. The truth was, people like them were used to no one challenging them. But now an entire room was watching, and so was a Navy SEAL with a service dog trained to protect. Ryan said loudly, you assaulted her. You poured hot liquid on a civilian. You verbally harassed her. This is all being documented. The officers paled. A woman in the back said, I saw everything. Another man added, we all did. Suddenly, the officers weren't in control anymore. Ryan stepped back, still recording. Shadow held position like a guardian crafted from loyalty and muscle. You should leave, Ryan said simply. The officers looked around at the crowd, at the phones recording them, at the dog ready to spring into action, and finally at Ryan, calm, composed, unwavering. They left, just walked out, cursing under their breath, but defeated. The moment the door closed behind them, the diner erupted into murmurs, half relief, half disbelief. Emily sank into a nearby booth, tears streaming quietly. The pain in her arm pulsed, but the emotional weight, the fear, the humiliation, felt heavier. Ryan approached her slowly. Let me see your arm. She hesitated, then held it out. The burn was red and swollen, painful to even look at. Ryan's heart clenched. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small first aid ointment he carried everywhere, a habit from years in the field. Shadow sat beside him, watching Emily with soft eyes now that the threat was gone. This might sting a little, Ryan said, applying the ointment gently. Emily winced but didn't pull away. She whispered, thank you, I don't even know your name. It's Ryan, he said quietly. And this is Shadow. Shadow nudged her hand, offering silent comfort, and Emily managed a small smile through her tears. You shouldn't have gotten involved, she murmured. They were officers. You could have gotten in trouble. Ryan shook his head. If people stay silent when someone is being hurt, nothing ever changes. Emily swallowed hard. No one has ever stood up for me like that. Ryan looked at her with genuine warmth. Then I'm glad today was the first time. The diner manager hurried over, apologizing profusely to Emily, promising to report the incident, offering support in ways he should have earlier but hadn't. Customers approached with words of comfort, leaving generous tips on the counter, telling her she didn't deserve any of what happened. Emily felt overwhelmed by kindness, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Later, after things calmed, Ryan sat with her while she took a break. She looked at him, studying the man who had stepped into chaos without hesitation. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. Ryan stared at his hands for a moment. "Because I've seen too much harm in this world. And I can't stop all of it. But today, I could stop this." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "Well, you changed my whole day. Maybe more than that." Ryan smiled faintly. "You deserve better. Everyone does." As the afternoon sun filtered through the diner windows, warming the quiet space, Emily realized something she hadn't felt in years, a renewed belief in people. In kindness, in courage, in the possibility that goodness still existed in a world that often felt unkind. Ryan, too, felt something shift. After months of grief and numbness, stepping in to protect someone brought a spark back into his heart, something he didn't expect to feel again so soon. Shadow rested his head on Emily's lap, sensing her pain and offering the silent comfort only a loyal dog could. When Emily finally stood to return to her shift, she turned to Ryan one last time. "Thank you, for being who you are." Ryan nodded. "And thank you for reminding me why we fight for good things." Emily walked back to work with a little more strength in her step, a little more hope in her heart. And Ryan watched her, grateful that in a simple diner on an ordinary afternoon, something extraordinary had happened, a moment of compassion that transformed two lives in ways neither expected. Sometimes, heroes don't appear in uniforms or capes. Sometimes, they walk into a diner with a service dog and a silent promise to protect what's right. And sometimes, the smallest act of courage becomes the spark that reminds the world that kindness still matters. And that day, in that small American diner, kindness won.